Inside his penthouse office, Dan James stood motionless. At 34, he was the youngest CFO in the history of the firm, a man whose reputation was built on cold logic and impenetrable emotion. But today, his composure was a mask covering a hollow chest. On his mahogany desk lay a thick, cream-colored envelope. The gold foil lettering mocked him. The wedding of Cassandra Vance and Marcus Sterling. Cassandra, the woman who had been his partner for 5 years, only to leave him for his greatest business rival the moment Dan's father passed away. She hadn't just broken his heart. She had attempted to dismantle his dignity. The wedding was set for Saturday at the Plaza Hotel, the very venue Dan had booked for their own wedding a year ago. "Sir, your car is waiting," his assistant, Sarah, whispered from the doorway. She saw the invitation. "You don't have to go, Dan. It's a trap. She wants to see you defeated." Dan turned, his eyes like flint. "If I don't go, she wins. If I go alone, she wins. I need a statement. I need to show her that she is replaceable, and that I have moved on to someone better." But who? The socialites of New York were all sharks. They would see through a fake date in seconds. Exasperated, Dan walked out of the building, dismissing his driver. He needed the sting of the cold air. He walked 3 blocks before he saw her. In the shadows of a closed bookstore, huddled under a thin, tattered tarp, sat a woman. She wasn't just another face of the city's forgotten. She was shielding something. A small boy, perhaps 4 years old, slept soundly in her arms despite the thunder. Dan stopped. The woman looked up. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair matted, but her eyes, a piercing, defiant emerald green, held a nobility that stopped him cold. She wasn't begging. She was guarding. "I don't have change," Dan said, his voice husky. "I didn't ask for any," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, though raspy from the cold. "Move along, suit. You're blocking the little heat we have left." Dan looked at her, then at the invitation in his pocket. A radical, insane idea took root. Cassandra expected a model. She expected a trophy. What if he brought someone who represented everything Cassandra hated? Someone real, someone he could transform. "What is your name?" Dan asked. "Helena," she said, pulling her son closer. "And this is Leo. Now, unless you're a cop or a social worker, leave us be." "Elena," Dan stepped closer, ignoring the rain soaking his $4,000 suit. "I have a proposition for you. It's a job. It pays $50,000 for 1 night of work, and it starts with a warm hotel room and a hot meal for your son." Elena laughed, a bitter, dry sound. "I've heard every line in this city, mister. I'm not that kind of girl." "It's not that," Dan said firmly. "I need a guest for a wedding. I need someone to help me settle a debt of the soul. I provide the dress, the shelter, and the security. You provide the presents. Tomorrow, we start. What do you say?" Elena looked at Leo's shivering shoulders, then back at the man in the rain. She saw the pain in his eyes, a different kind of poverty, but just as deep. She reached out her hand. "50,000, and Leo stays with me every second." "Deal," Dan said. As he helped her up, the trajectory of both their lives shifted forever. The penthouse at the St. Regis was a far cry from the damp sidewalk of 42nd Street. Dan had arranged for a private floor. He watched from the balcony as a team of stylists, sworn to secrecy, worked on Elena. For the first few hours, Elena was silent, almost catatonic with the shock of luxury. Leo was in the adjoining room, guarded by Dan's most trusted security detail, eating a bowl of pasta as if it were gold. "She's a diamond in the rough, Mr. James," the lead stylist whispered. "But the trauma is deep. Her skin is dehydrated, her hands are scarred." "Fix what you can," Dan said, "but don't take away the fire in her eyes. That's what I need." When Elena finally emerged, the room went silent. She wore a silk robe, her hair washed and flowing in dark waves. The grime was gone, revealing a bone structure that was breathtaking. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and that defiant gaze. "I feel like a fraud," Elena said, looking at her reflection. "I can smell the expensive soap on me, but I can still feel the grit of the subway under my fingernails. That's why you're perfect, Dan said, walking toward her. He handed her a folder. This is your story. You are Elena Vance, no relation to Cassandra. You are a philanthropist I met in London. You grew up in an orphanage. That part is true, isn't it? Elena nodded slowly. How did you know? I saw how you held Leo. You hold him like he's the only thing that exists because, for a long time, you were the only thing that existed for yourself. Dan spent the next 5 hours coaching her. He taught her which fork to use, how to hold a champagne flute by the stem, and how to look at him with affection. Why are you doing this, Dan? She asked during a break. You're rich, powerful. Why do you care what this Cassandra thinks? Because she told me I was a machine, Dan said, his jaw tightening. She said I had no heart, and that Marcus was the only one who could truly feel. I want to show her that I found someone with more soul in her pinky finger than Cassandra has in her entire body. You're using me as a weapon, Elena noted. I am. But a weapon that gets paid and fed. Just make sure you don't get cut by your own blade, she warned. As the sun rose over Central Park, Dan realized he wasn't just looking at a homeless woman anymore. He was looking at a woman who had survived hell, and suddenly, the petty drama of a high-society wedding felt small compared to the weight of her reality. The Plaza Hotel was a fortress of vanity. Paparazzi lined the entrance, eager to catch a glimpse of the wedding of the year. Dan's black Maybach pulled up to the curb. He stepped out, looking impeccable in a custom tuxedo. He turned and offered his hand to the door. When Elena stepped out, the camera flashes were blinding. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged her frame perfectly. Her jewelry was simple, pearls that Dan's mother had once worn. She moved with a strange, slow grace. The grace of someone who had spent years navigating dangerous streets and was now navigating a different kind of minefield. Breathe, Dan whispered, leaning into her ear. You look like a queen. I feel like an assassin, she whispered back, her hand trembling slightly against his arm. They entered the ballroom. The scent of 5,000 lilies was overwhelming. The who's who of New York was there, whispering behind fans and crystal glasses. Then the music shifted. Cassandra Vance stood near the altar, radiant in white, a vision of artificial perfection. Beside her stood Marcus Sterling, looking smug. When Cassandra saw Dan, a smirk began to form on her lips, until her eyes landed on Elena. The smirk vanished. The air seemed to leave Cassandra's lungs. She expected Dan to arrive looking haggard, or perhaps with a generic blonde model. She did not expect this woman, this ethereal, grounded presence, who looked at the room not with hunger, but with a quiet, observant disdain. Dan, Marcus said, stepping forward as they approached the receiving line. I didn't think you'd have the courage to show. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Marcus, Dan said, his voice smooth as silk. May I introduce Elena, my fiancée. The lie hung in the air like a lightning bolt. Elena didn't blink. She extended her hand to Cassandra. Congratulations, Cassandra. Dan has told me so much about you. It's brave what you've done here. Brave? Cassandra hissed, her eyes narrowing. What do you mean by that? To build a life on such a fragile foundation, Elena said, her voice dripping with a sincerity that felt like a slap. I hope you find the peace you're looking for. The crowd gasped. Dan felt a surge of adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. Elena wasn't just playing the part, she was owning it. But as the ceremony began, Dan noticed Elena's eyes darting to the exit. Her thoughts weren't on the revenge, they were on a little boy in a hotel room 3 blocks away. The reception was a blur of champagne and fake smiles. Dan and Elena were the center of attention. Every billionaire and CEO wanted to know who this mystery woman was. Elena handled them with a sharp wit that Dan hadn't anticipated. Where did you say you were from, dear? An older socialite asked. I spent a lot of time in the East Village, Elena said, a technical truth, as that was where her favorite shelter was. It's very grounding. Dan watched her, fascinated. She was navigating the elite with the same survival instincts she used on the streets. But the tension was mounting. Cassandra was watching them from the head table, her face turning a dangerous shade of red. During the first dance, Dan took Elena to the floor. As they moved, the distance between them closed. "You're doing incredible," Dan whispered. "I want to leave, Dan," she said, her voice cracking for the first time. "This place, it's suffocating. All this money spent on flowers while people are freezing outside. It's obscene. Just one more hour. Then we go." Suddenly, Cassandra appeared, intercepting them. "Dan, can I have a word? Privately?" "Anything you have to say you can say in front of Elena," Dan replied. Cassandra looked at Elena with pure vitriol. "I know people, Dan. I've lived in this city my whole life. I know every Vance in the social register. And there is no Elena Vance. Who is she? Some high-end escort you hired to spite me?" The room went quiet. People leaned in. Dan felt his pulse thundering in his neck. He was about to speak when Elena stepped forward. "You're right, Cassandra," Elena said, her voice projecting to the nearby tables. "I'm not in your register. I don't belong in your world of contracts and shadows. I'm just a woman who knows what it's like to lose everything. Dan found me when I was at my lowest, and he saw a person. You looked at him and saw a bank account. That's why he's with me. Because I can see him. Can you say the same for Marcus?" The silence was deafening. Marcus looked humiliated. Cassandra looked like she wanted to scream. Dan took Elena's hand, feeling a profound sense of pride. "We're leaving," Dan said. As they walked out, Dan realized the revenge didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the warmth of Elena's hand in his. The heavy mahogany doors of the St. Regis suite closed with a soft, expensive thud, sealing out the echoes of the plaza's jazz band and the whispers of New York's elite. Inside, the silence was heavy, thick with the scent of Elena's expensive perfume and the lingering metallic tang of adrenaline. Dan leaned against the doorframe, watching Elena as she moved toward the vanity. She looked like a fallen queen. The midnight blue velvet of her gown, which had looked so regal under the ballroom chandeliers, now seemed to weigh her down. A costume that had served its purpose, but was now merely a burden. She reached up, her fingers trembling slightly as she unclipped the heavy diamond earrings Dan had provided. They hit the marble surface with a sharp clack. In the mirror, her reflection looked back at her. Eyes wide, skin pale, the remnants of high society makeup masking the woman who, 48 hours ago, had been sleeping under a tarp. "The money is in an escrow account," Dan said, his voice low, breaking the silence like a stone dropped into a still pond. "My assistant confirmed the transfer an hour ago. It will be fully available to you by Monday morning. My lawyer, Miller, will be here at 10. He's already drafting the paperwork for a legal identity, social security card, birth certificate, the works. We'll find you an apartment, something secure with a doorman. You'll never have to look over your shoulder again." Elena didn't turn around. She stared at her own emerald eyes in the glass. "Why, Dan? I told you. It was a transaction. You played your part perfectly." "No," she said, finally turning to face him. The velvet dress swished around her ankles. "The transaction ended when the cake was cut. But back there, when Cassandra attacked you, when she called you a machine, you didn't just stand there, and I didn't just play a part. I defended you, and you protected me from those cameras. Why are you still helping me? You got your revenge. You embarrassed her. You can just let us go now. Give me a check and send us to a taxi." Dan stepped into the warm glow of the vanity lights. For the first time in his professional life, the CFO of Steel found himself struggling for a narrative. He had spent his career managing billions, predicting market fluctuations with surgical precision, yet he couldn't explain the tightening in his chest. "I didn't expect you to do that," Dan admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "In my world, loyalty is bought. It's a line item on a balance sheet. No one has ever stood up for me for who I am, the man behind the title, rather than what I have in my bank account. You saw a man being hurt, and you fought for him, even when you had nothing." "You were kind to my son," Elena said, her voice softening as she looked toward the bedroom where Leo was sleeping. "You bought him that bear. You made sure he was fed before you even thought about your own suit. In my world, Dan, kindness is the only currency that matters because it's the only one that can't be stolen." Dan sat on the edge of the velvet ottoman, the distance between them shrinking. "Stay here for a week, Elena. I'm serious. The transition from the street to a $50,000 bank account is a dangerous one. New York is a predator. It smells sudden wealth. Let me help you transition. Let me be your shield for just a few more days." "I've been a target my whole life, Dan," she whispered, stepping closer. "I know how to hide." "I don't want you to hide anymore," Dan said, and the intensity in his gaze was almost primal. "I want to protect you." The word protect hung in the air, foreign and heavy. Dan was a man of logic, of numbers, of cold, hard facts. But as he looked at Elena, really looked at her, he realized that the spreadsheet of his life was missing its most vital entry. Over the next few days, the CFO vanished. Dan stopped answering calls from the board. He ignored emails about the merger. Instead, he spent his mornings in the suite's kitchenette, learning how Leo liked his toast. He sat on the floor and taught the 4-year-old the basic movements of chess, fascinated by the boy's quick mind. He watched Elena rediscover the simple dignities of life. A long shower without fear, a book read in a quiet corner, the feeling of a bed that didn't smell of damp concrete. One evening, over a pot of Earl Grey, the walls finally came down. Elena told him about the factory fire that took her husband, David. She told him how the corporate lawyers, men exactly like Dan, had found a loophole in the insurance policy to avoid paying the death benefit. She told him how her family had seen her as a liability once the money ran out. "I've spent my life making people like you efficient on a spreadsheet, Elena," Dan said, his heart heavy with a new kind of shame. "I've signed off on layoffs and restructuring without ever thinking about the faces behind the numbers. I thought I was being a good businessman. I didn't realize I was being a ghost." "Now you know," Elena said, reaching out to touch his hand. Her touch was warm, real, and grounding. "The question isn't who you were, Dan. It's what are you going to do about it now?" The modern fairy tale was a fragile thing, and New York City was a place where glass slippers were easily crushed under the boots of the powerful. Marcus Sterling was not a man who accepted humiliation. To Marcus, being outshone by Dan at his own wedding was a declaration of war. It was a Tuesday, one of those rare, crisp Manhattan afternoons where the sky is a piercing blue. Dan, Elena, and Leo were in a quiet corner of Central Park, away from the tourists. Dan was watching Leo chase a group of pigeons, the boy's laughter a sound that had become Dan's favorite melody. For a moment, Dan felt like a normal man, not a CFO, not a millionaire, just a man with a family. Then, his phone vibrated. It was a private line, one only his head of security, Vance, used. "Sir, we have a problem." Vance's voice was clipped, professional, but laced with urgency. Marcus Sterling didn't just go on his honeymoon. He hired a fixer, a private investigator named Hatcher. They've spent the last 72 hours digging into Elena's past. They found the shelter records. They found the police reports from when she was evicted. And sir, they found the missing person file. Dan's blood turned to ice. The missing person file? She wasn't a criminal, Vance. No, sir. But after the factory fire, when she couldn't pay the bills, she vanished from the system to avoid her husband's creditors. Technically, the state marked her as a transient of interest regarding some unpaid medical debts. Marcus has leaked everything. He's framed it as a massive fraud. He's calling her a professional grifter who targeted a grieving CFO. "Kill the story," Dan ordered, his voice a low growl. "Buy the publisher. I don't care what it costs." "It's too late, sir. It's already on the front page of the New York Post. CFO's fiancée is a homeless fraud." The headline is everywhere. The paparazzi are already converging on the St. Regis. Dan looked at Elena. She was laughing, her hair catching the sunlight as she picked Leo up and swung him around. She looked so happy, so safe. And in an instant, Dan knew that the world was about to tear that safety away. "We have to go," Dan said, walking quickly toward them. His face was a mask of granite. When they arrived at the hotel, the scene was a nightmare. A sea of cameras and microphones blocked the entrance. "Elena, is it true you were living in a box? Dan, did you pay for a fake fiancé?" Vance and the security team managed to usher them through a service entrance, but the damage was done. In the elevator, Elena's eyes landed on a discarded newspaper on a housekeeping cart. The photo was grainy, a shot of her from a security camera at a soup kitchen 6 months ago. The headline screamed, "The Hobo Bride, James's Scam Exposed." The color drained from her face. She collapsed against the elevator wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They know. Dan. They know everything. They're going to take Leo, aren't they? They'll say a woman like me, a fraud, a liar, isn't fit to be a mother. Dan grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Elena, look at me. I have the power here. I have the best legal team in the country. I will fix this. We'll tell them we met through my charity work. I'll say the media is twisting the facts, that you were an undercover consultant for my foundation. We'll give them a lie they can swallow. Elena shook him off, her eyes flashing with a sudden fierce dignity. No. No? Dan blinked. Elena, it's the only way to save your reputation. Don't you see, Dan? She cried, her voice echoing in the small elevator. That's exactly what Marcus wants. He wants us to be ashamed. He wants us to hide the truth because he thinks being poor is a sin. If we lie, we're telling the world that I should be ashamed of surviving. I'm not a fraud. I'm a survivor. And if you lie for me, you're just like them, protecting the brand instead of the person. Dan stood frozen as the elevator doors opened. He had spent his life protecting brands, managing perceptions, and polishing images. But looking at Elena, he realized that the truth was the only thing that couldn't be devalued by a market crash. You're right, Dan whispered. The truth it is. The boardroom of James Financial felt like a courtroom. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the cold, sterile smell of air conditioning. 12 men and 2 women sat around the glass table, their faces grim. At the head of the table sat the chairman, Arthur Sterling, Marcus's uncle. Dan, Arthur began, tapping a gold pen against the table. This situation, this scandal with this woman from the streets, it's a circus. The stock dropped 4 points this morning. The shareholders are screaming about character clauses and brand integrity. You need to end this, now. Dan stood at his place, his hands resting lightly on the back of his chair. He didn't look like a man under fire. He looked like a man who had finally found his purpose. And how would you like me to end it, Arthur? Distance yourself, the chairman snapped. Issue a statement saying you were misled by a woman seeking to exploit your wealth. Fire her from whatever consultant role you've concocted. Pay her off, give her enough to disappear back into the shadows where she belongs, and issue a public apology for your temporary lapse in judgment. Dan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of a shark. I won't be doing any of that, Dan said, his voice echoing with a newfound authority. In fact, I am announcing a complete pivot of our corporate social responsibility arm. As of this morning, I am diverting $50 million from the luxury gala budget to found the James Vance Foundation. It will focus entirely on transitional housing, legal defense for the disenfranchised, and job placement for single parents. A collective gasp went up around the table. You're insane, one board member shouted. You're doubling down on a homeless woman? Her name is Elena, Dan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. And she has more integrity in her left hand than this entire board has in its collective history. She didn't exploit me. She saved me from becoming a hollow suit like all of you. If you want my resignation, you can have it. But remember, I hold the personal loyalty of the Vanguard Group and the BlackRock managers. If I walk, 40% of your capital walks with me. Do we have an understanding? The silence that followed was absolute. Money wasn't just talking, it was screaming. While Dan was fighting in the boardroom, a different kind of battle was happening at the hotel. Marcus Sterling had managed to bypass the main security, using his family's influence with the hotel's ownership. He found Elena in the lobby, waiting for her car. You're a parasite, Elena, Marcus hissed, stepping into her personal space. He looked at her with a disgust that was almost physical. Dan is using you. He's a CFO. He's playing a long game of pity branding. Once the cameras leave, he'll toss you back to the gutter. You're a tool for him to look human after his father's death. He pulled a checkbook from his breast pocket and scribbled a number. He ripped the leaf off and held it out. $100,000, right now. Just take the boy and get on a bus to anywhere but here. If you stay, I'll make sure the state takes that kid away from you faster than you can say vagrancy. Elena looked at the check. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. It was a ticket to a quiet life, far from the war between billionaires. Then, she looked Marcus in the eye. You think everyone has a price, Marcus, because you've sold your soul so many times you've forgotten what it feels like to own it, she said, her voice steady and clear. She took the check. Marcus smirked, victory flashing in his eyes, until she slowly, methodically, tore the paper into dozens of tiny pieces. She let them flutter to the marble floor like confetti. Dan didn't save me from the street, Elena said, stepping closer until Marcus had to back away. He reminded me that I was a human being worthy of a seat at the table. And you? You're just a small, frightened man who's afraid of a woman who has nothing left to lose. Tell Cassandra I said hello. I hear the wedding was expensive. She walked past him, her head held high, leaving Marcus standing over a pile of shredded paper in a lobby that suddenly felt much too big for him. The victory in the boardroom was short-lived. Marcus, pushed to the brink of madness by his public humiliation, decided to strike at the only thing Dan and Elena couldn't protect with money: the law. It was a rainy Thursday, the sky over Manhattan a bruised purple. Dan was in the suite, finalizing the foundation's charter, when a heavy knock sounded at the door. It wasn't the rhythmic knock of the hotel staff. It was the authoritative, rhythmic thud of the law. Vance opened the door, but he was stepped over by a woman in a gray suit and two uniformed NYPD officers. "Elena Vance," the woman said, holding up a badge. "I'm Agent Sarah Miller with Child Protective Services. We've received an anonymous and very detailed tip regarding the welfare of a minor, Leo Vance. The report cites unstable living conditions, child endangerment due to lack of permanent housing, and a history of maternal instability." Elena froze. She was in the middle of coloring with Leo at the dining table. Her face went ashen, a look of pure, primal terror crossing her features. She pulled Leo into her lap, clutching him so tight the boy started to whimper. "No!" Elena cried. "I have a job. I have a home. We're safe here." "Ma'am, this is a hotel," the agent said, her voice a practiced, chilling neutral. "And according to our records, you have no documented income, no permanent lease, and your employment is listed as a personal guest of Mr. James. Given the media reports of the scam involved, we are required to take the child into temporary state custody until a full fitness hearing can be conducted." The officer stepped forward, reaching for Leo. "Come on, kid. Just a little walk." "Don't touch him!" Dan's voice roared through the suite. He stepped into the room, his eyes blazing. He looked like a man ready to burn the city down. "Mr. James, don't interfere," the officer warned. "We have a court order." "And I have a legal reality you haven't considered," Dan snapped. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "This is a 20-year lease agreement for a 4-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn Heights, signed and notarized 48 hours ago. Elena Vance is the primary tenant. This," he slapped another paper down, "is an ironclad employment contract for the James Vance Foundation. She is the executive director, with a salary of $200,000 a year." "The report says she's a transient," the agent countered. "That this is all a front for a revenge plot against Marcus Sterling." "Then investigate me." Dan stepped between the officers and Elena, his chest heaving. "I am the legal guarantor. I have placed $5 million in a trust for that boy's education. If you take that child tonight, you will be violating the rights of a woman who is gainfully employed and legally housed. You will be facing a civil rights lawsuit that will dismantle your department and end your careers. Is that a risk your department is willing to take on behalf of a tip from a man with a personal vendetta?" The room was electric with tension. Leo was crying now, hiding his face in Elena's neck. Elena was shaking, her tears soaking the boy's shirt. Dan stood his ground, a titan protecting his own. The CPS agent looked at the documents, then at the officers, and finally at the raw, desperate love in the room. She was a mother herself, and she could see that this wasn't a scam. It was a sanctuary. "We will leave the child in your care for tonight, Mr. James," the agent said, her voice softening just a fraction. "But there will be a follow-up visit tomorrow at the new address. If any of this, the lease, the job, is found to be fraudulent, we will return with a warrant. Do you understand?" "I'll be waiting," Dan said. When the door finally closed, Elena collapsed. She fell to her knees, still holding Leo, her sobs racking her entire body. Dan dropped down beside her, wrapping his arms around both of them. "They almost took him," she whispered into Dan's chest. "They almost took my baby because of your world, because of Marcus, because of the money." "I know," Dan whispered, his own eyes wet. "I'm so sorry, Elena. I didn't realize how high the price would be. But I'm not letting go. I've spent my life protecting wealth that didn't matter. I'm not letting go of the only thing that does. Not ever." The weeks that followed were a blur of transformation. The media, fickle as ever, moved on to a new scandal, and Dan used his influence to bury the hobo bride story under a mountain of press releases about the foundation's work. But the real work was happening in a quiet, sun-drenched apartment in Brooklyn Heights. It was a beautiful space, high ceilings, large windows overlooking the East River, and a room for Leo that was filled with books instead of fear. Dan visited every day. At first, he told himself it was to oversee the foundation's transition, but soon he stopped making excuses. He found himself leaving the office at 4 p.m. just to catch the sunset with them. He traded his $4,000 suits for cashmere sweaters and jeans. He even attempted to cook, a disastrous lasagna that ended with them ordering pizza and laughing until their sides ached. One evening, after Leo had finally fallen asleep in his new bed, Dan and Elena sat on the small balcony. The lights of the Brooklyn Bridge twinkled like a string of diamonds across the water. "You're still here," Elena said softly, leaning her head against the brick wall. "The board is quiet. Marcus has been sidelined by his own father. You've won, Dan. You don't have to play the hero anymore. You can go back to your penthouse and your billions." Dan looked out at the water. "I went back there last night. To the penthouse. It felt like a tomb, Elena. I looked at my art, my furniture, my success, and all I could see was the void where a life was supposed to be." He turned to her, taking her hand. Her skin was soft now, the calluses of the street fading, but the strength in her grip remained. "I spent my whole life calculating the return on investment," Dan continued. "I thought love was a contract with favorable terms. I thought Cassandra was a good partner, because her family's portfolio matched mine. I was a mathematician of the soul, Elena, and I was failing the most important test. And now the math doesn't work." Dan smiled, a genuine, tired, happy smile. "I'm investing everything I have into a woman who tore up a $100,000 check, and a boy who thinks I'm a hero because I can make a knight jump over a pawn. That's a terrible ROI on paper, but for the first time in my life, I feel like the richest man in the world." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring. Not a diamond the size of a grape, but a delicate gold band with a single clear emerald. "I don't want to go back to my empty life, Elena. I want to stay here. Not as a protector, but as a partner. If you'll have me." Elena looked at the ring, then at the man who had started this journey seeking revenge and ended it seeking redemption. She didn't see the CFO. She saw Dan. "I spent so long being the homeless mom," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I forgot I was just Elena. You didn't just give me a house, Dan. You gave me a mirror where I could see a person worth loving again." They kissed then, a slow, certain kiss that tasted of salt and hope. It wasn't for the cameras, and it wasn't a strike against Marcus. It was a promise made in the quiet of a Brooklyn night, louder than any headline. 1 year later, the Plaza Hotel was once again ablaze with light. Black SUVs lined the curb, and the air was filled with the familiar hum of New York's high society. But the guest list was different tonight. Mingling with the CEOs and socialites were social workers, former residents of shelters, and community leaders. It was the first annual James Vance Foundation Gala for Urban Housing. In the wings of the stage, Dan adjusted his tie. He felt a small hand tug on his jacket. He looked down to see Leo, dressed in a tiny tuxedo, looking remarkably like a junior executive. "Do I have to go out there, Dan?" Leo asked. Just for a minute, buddy, Dan said, ruffling the boy's hair. To show them who we're fighting for. Dan walked onto the stage. The applause was respectful, but the room felt different than it had a year ago. There was a sense of purpose. In the back, near the bar, Dan spotted two figures who hadn't been invited but had bought tickets anyway, desperate to remain relevant. Marcus and Cassandra Sterling. They looked older. Marcus's face was lined with the stress of a dozen lawsuits, and Cassandra looked brittle, her perfect marriage already a subject of tabloid gossip regarding Marcus's infidelity. They looked like ghosts of a world Dan no longer inhabited. Dan didn't feel anger when he saw them. He felt nothing, and that was the greatest victory of all. I used to believe that success was a number, Dan said into the microphone, his voice steady and resonant. I believed that life was a zero-sum game, that for me to win, someone else had to lose. I spent 30 years taking from the world, building walls of gold to keep the reality of life at bay. He paused, looking toward the side of the stage. But a year ago, I met someone who showed me that the only true measure of a man is who he is willing to protect when there is nothing to gain. I learned that the most powerful thing you can do with wealth is to use it as a bridge, not a wall. He extended his hand. Please welcome the executive director of the James Vance Foundation, and the woman who taught me how to be human, my wife, Elena James. Elena stepped out into the light. She was breathtaking. She wore a sharp-tailored suit of cream silk, a power suit in the truest sense. She walked with a confidence that wasn't borrowed or bought. It was earned. Beside her, Leo waved at the crowd, his smile bright and unafraid. The standing ovation lasted for 3 minutes. Later that night, long after the last guest had left, Dan and Elena walked through Central Park. They followed the same path they had taken a year ago, past the bookstore where they had first met in the rain. The air was warm, a gentle summer breeze rustling the leaves. Dan stopped by a specific wooden bench, the one where he had once seen a shivering woman clutching a child. You know, Dan said, pulling her close and looking at the skyline. The CFO finally got his revenge. Elena smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. Oh yeah? And how did he manage that? By ruining Marcus's credit score? No, Dan said, kissing the top of her head. By realizing that the best revenge isn't hurting the people who left you. It isn't proving them wrong or watching them fail. He turned her to face him, the city lights reflected in their eyes. It's building a life so full of light, so anchored in love and truth, that you don't even remember their names. It's finding a home in a person, not a penthouse. The city hummed around them, a symphony of 8 million stories. But as they walked toward the subway to catch a train back to Brooklyn, they knew that their story was the only one that mattered. The hobo bride and the cold CFO were gone, replaced by a family that had turned a revenge plot into a sanctuary. Under the watch of 1,000 tiny stars, they finally made it home.